This afternoon's session is on observing systems, networks and history, and we're going to kick off this session with Lesley talking about 80 years at PSMSL.
Okay, thank you very much. We didn't think that this workshop would be complete without some discussion of PSMSL, and I thought rather than 80 years at the PSMSL, which made it sound as if I'd been here that long, we'd go for celebrating 80 years. So, because the audience is quite mixed, I want to give some basic information about PSMSL and then tell you a little bit more about where we're at, give you some history of the past 80 years. So what is PSMSL for? We collect, publish, analyse and interpret information on sea level changes from a global network of tide gauges, and we are the main international data bank for this. We've operated under ICSU, the International Council for Science, since 1958. We've cooperated with the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission since it was set up in the early 1960s, and we're funded by the UK Natural Environment Research Council, based here in Liverpool at the National Oceanography Centre. So our basic activities are shown up here. We're responsible for collecting in data from those who operate tide gauges, some analysis of that data. Research is a good way of QCing the data. Inputting the data set to IPCC is another good way of the data being used. The data are distributed, and in addition to monthly and annual means, together with the British Oceanographic Data Centre, we're responsible for the high frequency, that is greater than monthly, so hourly through to 5-minute values for delayed mode data from the GLOS sites. We have a variety of products, and we have a wider service. To give you an idea of the data set, each dot on the map is where we have data from. If it's blue, then we have recent data. Recent in our terms is the last year or two, and then this goes through to the white dots where we haven't had any data since before 1993. And this might be because the gauge no longer exists, but this sort of map gives you a very quick visual impact of where we're missing data, where the coverage is not so good, and you can see for yourselves where that is. I mentioned that we also provide a wider service as well as maintaining a data bank, and this shows you some of the activities that we undertake in that respect. And it's important that we can provide technical advice, and when I mean technical advice to tide gauge operators, we're helped in this by colleagues who run tide gauge activities within NOC, so we can draw on a wider community beyond those of us who are working for the permanent service. We provide data processing advice, scientific advice to a variety of places. The public are very interested in sea level change, so we provide information and advice to them. The data are available from our website. We have data from about, just over 2,000 sites, but not all of those, as you saw, are completely up to date. We also have 5,000 years plus of higher frequency data from the GLOS sites. We've run a number of training courses over the years, and the information from those, plus other useful information if you're interested in sea level and tide gauges, that's all available from our website. So now the history. Where did it all begin? Well, obviously we have to go back to 1933, 80 years ago, and at the 5th General Assembly of IUGG in Lisbon, there was a meeting of the International Association of Physical Oceanography, the forerunner of IAPSO, and that meeting set up a mean sea level committee. This was done under the direction of Professor Rolf Witting, who was a renowned oceanographer, director of the now no longer existing Finnish Institute of Marine Research. And in addition to being an oceanographer, he was also a politician and a member of the cabinet of the Finland government over quite a longish period. He was elected secretary of IAPO in 1930. The other person who had an important role to play in PSMSL was Professor Joseph Proudman, who the Pro-Vice-Chancellor mentioned this morning, who was born nearby here in Lancashire and was a lecturer at Liverpool University. And he formed the Liverpool Tidal Institute in 1919 and moved from the university here across to Bidston Observatory on the Wirral, the other side of the Mersey. He was appointed secretary of the Mean Sea Level Committee and went about his work with the assistance of the International Hydrographic Organisation and Bureau. So why did this committee get set up? Why do we want to know about mean sea level? Well, I'll read you the quote here from a paper prepared by Witting. For the study of the tides and tidal currents, of other movements of the sea surface and currents of different origin, continual observations of sea level are the sole or most valuable basis. For the solution of a complex of geophysical problems, data regarding sea level and its changes are of great importance. So Witting had interests in oceanography, but also in isostatic adjustment. Proudman was interested in ocean dynamics. We were not talking about sea level change, sea level rise at that time, but the first publication on the global rate of sea level rise came in 1941, based on the first compilation of mean sea level data by PSMSL. For a long time, we produced our mean sea level data bank on paper. So there were a number of publications scientifiques which had compilations of mean sea level data, and then following that, and in the late 1960s, when one of the directors, Rossiter, he devised a mechanism for a revised local reference, which meant that data would be reduced to a common datum, and following that, we started publishing bigger, thicker volumes on paper up until the 1980s, when we moved to magnetic tapes, which are now pretty obsolete. Floppy disks went the same way, and now we're producing the data via the web. It gets updated much more rapidly, but we can also provide the data set on CD for those who don't have good internet access. Looking at what we have in the data bank, there are some long records from each continent, which you can see on the here, starting with Takoradi in Africa, going through down to Brest at the bottom. And most of these are showing evidence for rise in sea level over the past century. But just to mention that the data we have not been corrected for any vertical land movements. So you can see again here the various differences that you get. So up at the top with Stockholm, there's a fall due to isostatic adjustment, and Thomas, where he is, can tell you a lot about that. Then we have other issues within the data due to earthquakes, groundwater, river discharges, siltation, and these all need to be taken account of. More recently, in addition to providing just the mean sea level data, we've produced interactive maps of various products. I'm not going to explain them in detail, but this one here shows you anomalies, and you can look at the level relative to 1960 to 1990, either detrended or not. In addition, you can have a look at relative sea level trends, again choosing the period that you want to look at, subject to some constraints. This comes with a health warning because we've not done anything to the data for vertical land movements. Going back to Jack Rossiter, one of the earlier directors, he produced a paper on PSMSL for the International Hydrographic Review in 1962. And what's interesting about this is some of the things he mentioned then are still true today. There's a need for more permanent gauges, efficiently maintained, producing records which are accurately processed to give mean levels. And he then says, as a personal ambition for the permanent service, he would be pleased if over the next 25 years we could build up a better network of data. And I think we're still trying to do that now, 50 years on from that. But one step towards this was the establishment of the Global Sea Level Observing System, initially under IOC and now under JCOM. The two people who were the masterminds behind this, if you like, were David Pugh, who's sitting at the back in the audience now, and Klaus Witting. The plan was to establish a network, a core network of 300 stations, well distributed throughout the world, related to higher density regional networks and for various uses, but local uses as well as more global uses. And this would serve the scientific community well and provide a global baseline. So where are we up to on this? We're doing fairly well, but some areas are a bit of a problem, and a big effort has gone into putting in tide gauges around Africa over the last 10 years or so, and also the Western Indian Ocean, particularly following the tsunami in 2004. We've run training courses for tide gauge operators and technical courses for technicians involved in setting up the gauges. So this has had some success, but we really need to keep this going, keep the gauges maintained and calibrated into the future so that we can improve the global data set. We want to make sure that the permanent service is useful and continues to be useful. So we searched the scientific literature and found that in 2012, 61 papers were published that used the data set. So we felt reasonably pleased over that. We've also contributed to the IPCC 5th assessment, with Svetlana being a lead author and Philip Woodworth being a review editor, and other past and present PSMSL staff contributing. The data set itself is also widely referenced in the IPCC assessment. So just to illustrate this, I'm not going to talk about the figures I've got here. This is to indicate where the PSMSL data has been used. So obviously in this one you have an example of some of the longer term records from a selection of tide gauge stations, and it shows how the data at particular points compare with the global estimate of sea level change. Then we have some longer term records showing anomalies relative to 1900-1905, and finally we've got this plot showing the work by different groups on reconstructions into the past. So all of these are using the PSMSL data. Our plans for the future: we want to improve our integration with the higher frequency data set and improve the quality of our metadata that tells you more about the data itself. We want to keep in contact with the data suppliers. That might sound a bit odd, but in this age where we can scrape data from websites, you miss quite a lot of the information that you get by interacting with individuals, so we want to keep doing that. Data are being made available more and more in real time, but quite a lot of those don't seem to get processed through to monthly and annual means, so we need to do some work there. We want to improve the information on our website to include uncertainties and errors in the tide gauge data set. We want to add bottom pressure records and redevelop our capacity building and training material. So a quick summary: we believe that PSMSL continues to be active in workshops and conferences such as this, and also with acquiring the data and performing analysis of those data sets. We continue to provide mean sea level data to users, and that produces a wide range of scientific and practical products, some of which we're involved with ourselves. We collaborate with and advise the community, whether it be scientific input to IPCC, input to governments, IOC, UNESCO, other science activities or knowledge transfer to the public. We continue to provide technical advice to tight gauge operators, data processing advice as well, and we provide training and other information. So thank you very much. I hope that's a good summary.